That night changed everything. I didn't know it then, but nothing would ever be the same again. The car was quiet, too quiet for comfort. I leaned back in the passenger seat, trying to avoid looking over at him, trying to ignore the tension that had begun to swirl between us. It was just supposed to be a ride home. But as the city lights passed by in a blur, something in the air shifted, something unspoken, something I couldn't quite grasp but felt deep inside. The sound of the engine hums in my ears, but it couldn't drown out the rapid beats of my heart. I glance out the window, watching the familiar streets pass, but my mind is elsewhere. It's on the man driving beside me, my best friend's dad, David. For years, I'd known him as just a quiet, serious figure in the background of my life, a man I'd occasionally see at family barbecues or on the sidelines of my best friend's soccer games. But tonight, everything was different. I'm not sure when it started, this awareness, this feeling that had bloomed from something innocent into something else entirely. Maybe it was the way he'd looked at me a few weeks ago, just before we went on this impromptu road trip, or maybe it was the way he'd talked to me with more attention lately, more care, more curiosity. But there was something in the way his eyes lingered just a little longer when we spoke, something that made my skin tingle with uncertainty. It wasn't that I had never noticed him before. David was undeniably attractive, in that mature, confident way that had always stood out. But the feeling that was creeping up on me now wasn't admiration. It was something deeper, more dangerous. Something I'd tried to ignore, something I wasn't sure I should even acknowledge. But it was there, like a heavy weight in the air, something hanging between us that neither of us knew how to address. I couldn't deny that my thoughts kept drifting back to him, and even now as I sat beside him, every movement, every subtle shift in the car seemed to magnify the tension. I took a slow breath, my eyes flickering to him. He hadn't said much since we left the last stop. His jaw was clenched in concentration as he drove, his hands gripping the wheel with quiet intensity. But I couldn't ignore how his presence seemed to fill the space, how it made everything feel more charged, more intimate. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, my thoughts running wild. There was no way he could feel what I was feeling, right? He was my best friend's dad. He was old enough to be my father. But in this moment, the distance between us didn't seem so wide anymore. And then it happened, something small, something subtle, but it changed everything. He reached over to adjust the air conditioning, his arm brushing against mine in a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through me. My breath caught in my throat, my body going rigid, and I tried to pretend it didn't affect me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to shift. The tension between us had only just begun to unfold, but I could already sense that it would lead somewhere neither of us could control. I couldn't help but wonder, what would happen next? Would I be able to stop what was happening between us, or would this ride, this moment, be the beginning of something irreversible? We had known each other for years, but it wasn't until recently that things started to feel different. It was something subtle, a change in the way we spoke, the way we interacted. David, my best friend's dad, had always been a quiet and reserved man. He wasn't the type to draw attention to himself, preferring to remain in the background at family gatherings or barbecues. He was the strong, silent type, the kind of man who had worked hard all his life and didn't expect anything in return. But there was always something about him that intrigued me. I'd spent a lot of time with him over the years, mostly in the presence of my best friend, Lucas. We'd hang out at his place, watch sports on TV, or play video games. The occasional family outings would see David standing off to the side, observing rather than engaging. But even then, there was a quiet intensity about him. I always admired his calm demeanor, the way he exuded confidence without having to say much. But there was no way I could have anticipated how things would change between us in such a short span of time. It had started innocently enough, a shared interest in cars. Lucas had been obsessed with them for as long as I could remember, and naturally, David had taken an active role in nurturing that passion. I'd never been particularly interested in cars myself, but when Lucas had insisted on taking me along to one of their weekend garage sessions, I reluctantly agreed. That was the first time David and I had spent any real one-on-one time together. It wasn't the most exciting afternoon. I spent most of it fiddling with the parts and pretending to know what I was doing, but David didn't mind. He was patient with me, explaining things in a way that made it all feel more interesting than it really was. The more we talked, the more I found myself appreciating his calmness, his understated wisdom. And slowly, I began to see him in a different light. We started spending more time together, often without Lucas. A weekend barbecue here and there, or a trip to the hardware store for a new project around the house. It wasn't intentional. At least, I didn't think it was. We were just two people who happened to get along. But there were moments, small moments, that made me pause. Like the time we'd gone on a quick errand, just the two of us. It was nothing special, picking up supplies for a home project. But as we walked through the aisles, I found myself acutely aware of his presence. His voice, low and steady as he made small talk. The way he'd glance over at me as if searching for some unspoken approval. There were these tiny instances where his touch would linger, even if it was just brushing my shoulder to get my attention, or the way his hand would rest a little too long on the back of my neck when he was helping me with something. I couldn't help but notice how it made my heart race, how my body would react in ways I didn't fully understand. But I convinced myself that I was just imagining things. It was normal for a father figure to show care and attention, right? Especially someone as kind and patient as David. He was just being supportive, nothing more. That's what I kept telling myself. But then there were moments I couldn't explain away. Like when we went on our first road trip together. It was supposed to be a casual, no-pressure drive to a nearby town for a weekend getaway. Lucas had invited me, but something had come up for him at the last minute, and David insisted I still go. He said it would be good for me, that we'd have fun just the two of us. I agreed, mostly because I didn't want to disappoint him. The drive had been long, but there was a strange ease between us. We talked about everything and nothing. The sound of the engine became a soothing backdrop to our conversation, and I found myself laughing at his dry sense of humor. It was one of those rare moments where time seemed to slow down, and I didn't feel like I was just a guest in someone else's life. I felt like I belonged there, next to him. But something else had started to surface. It wasn't just the ease of the conversation, or the shared silence that made me feel comfortable. There was a warmth, a closeness, that I couldn't explain. The way his eyes would flicker toward me in the rearview mirror, the way his hand would brush against mine when we passed a soda can from the back seat. It felt like he was paying attention in a way that was different, deeper than just casual friendship. And that's when I began to realize something that made me uncomfortable. I had begun to look forward to our time together, to these moments that felt more intimate than they should have been. I found myself wondering about his life outside of the role of a father, and suddenly, I was interested in everything about him. The little details, the way he dressed, the way he carried himself, even the way his hands looked as they gripped the wheel. I hadn't meant for it to happen. It wasn't something I could control, but there it was, this strange shift in the way I saw him. I couldn't tell if it was just me, or if he felt it too. There were these small signs, these little clues that hinted at something more. A lingering look, a brief touch that felt charged with more than just casual familiarity. But every time I tried to push it away, to dismiss it as nothing more than a fleeting feeling, it lingered. And then, during that drive, when we had passed the familiar streets of our neighborhood and were nearing the end of our trip, something changed. He seemed different, his usual quiet confidence replaced with something else. Something softer, but also more intense. I caught myself staring at him, trying to figure out what he was thinking, but he wasn't looking at me the way he usually did. Instead, his gaze was distant, his thoughts seemingly elsewhere. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change between us, that this simple road trip had turned into something much more significant. The silence in the car grew heavier, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw him shift uncomfortably in his seat. As if something inside him, just like me, had changed. The atmosphere between us crackled with unspoken words, and I couldn't decide if I should confront it, or if I should continue pretending nothing was happening. But the truth was, things were already changing. And no matter how much I tried to deny it, I could feel the weight of it. The tension between us had been building for weeks, and I could feel it in the air now more than ever. There was no denying it, something had shifted. Something that neither of us had explicitly acknowledged, but was palpable in every glance, every brush of the hand, every quiet moment between us. It had all started so innocently, but now it was hard to ignore the fact that we were both walking a fine line, one that neither of us seemed willing, or perhaps able, to cross. It was subtle at first, these small changes. A lingering look. A seemingly accidental touch. A conversation that went just a little too deep, just a little too personal. I had started to notice how different David seemed when it was just the two of us. The way his voice would soften when he spoke to me, the way he would smile when I made a joke, like it was something he genuinely appreciated. There were times when our interactions felt entirely normal, like nothing had changed, but I couldn't escape the feeling that I was seeing him in a new light. I remember the first time I really became aware of it. We had spent the entire afternoon working on a project together. It wasn't anything special, just fixing up an old piece of furniture in his garage. But there was something about the way we worked side by side, our hands occasionally brushing as we passed tools back and forth, that made everything feel charged. The more time we spent in close proximity, the more I realized how aware I was of every little movement, every little sound that came from him. At one point, I had reached across him to grab something from the workbench, and our hands brushed against each other for a fraction of a second. I could feel the warmth of his skin, the calluses from years of hard work, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. My heart raced, my breath hitched, and I had to force myself to look away, to focus on anything but that touch. But David didn't seem to notice, or maybe he did, and was pretending he didn't. Either way, he didn't say anything, and neither did I. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something between us now. It wasn't just admiration or respect anymore. It was something deeper, something that lingered beneath the surface, threatening to break through at any moment. And the more I tried to push it away, the stronger it seemed to grow. Over the next few days, it became impossible to ignore. I found myself thinking about him at the strangest times, at work, in the shower, late at night when I should have been sleeping. It wasn't just the way he looked at me, or the way he touched me. It was the way he made me feel. Like I mattered to him. Like I was important, in a way I hadn't realized before. But the more I thought about it, the more confused I became. This wasn't normal. He was my best friend's dad. This was something I should be pushing away, not welcoming. But every time I saw him, every time he spoke to me, it felt like a magnet pulling me in, drawing me closer to something I wasn't sure I was ready for. It didn't help that he seemed to notice the shift too. His actions, his behavior, started to change. He would catch my eye for just a little too long, his gaze lingering in a way that felt almost too intimate. And when he spoke to me, his voice was lower, softer, like he was trying to say something without saying it. I couldn't tell if he was struggling with the same feelings I was, or if he was just being his usual thoughtful self. But there were times when I could feel his uncertainty, his hesitation, and it only made the tension between us worse. The first real indication that something was about to change came one evening when we were alone in his living room, watching a movie. Lucas had gone out with some friends, leaving the two of us to spend the evening together. It had been a quiet night, mostly just casual conversation, the kind of conversations we'd always had. But then, out of nowhere, the air between us seemed to thicken. I could feel it. I could feel his presence next to me in a way that I hadn't before. When the movie ended, there was a strange silence. Neither of us said anything for a moment. David leaned back on the couch, his arm resting on the back behind me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I was acutely aware of his every move, his every breath. It felt like we were both waiting for something, but neither of us knew what that something was. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, hesitant, as if he wasn't entirely sure what he was about to say. "You know," he began, his gaze shifting toward the window, avoiding my eyes. "You've really grown up, you know that?" His words seemed innocent enough, but they carried more weight than I was prepared for. I nodded, unsure of what to say in return. But his tone lingered in my mind, his words hanging in the air like a question I didn't know how to answer. "It's strange," he continued, his voice still soft, "how fast time goes by. 1 minute, you're just a kid, and the next you're," he trailed off, his gaze now turning to meet mine. His eyes were darker than I remembered, a hint of something deeper in them. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it made my pulse quicken. I swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how close we were, how intimate this moment felt. His hand shifted slightly, coming to rest on the arm of the couch, just a few inches away from mine. I wanted to move away to break the tension, but my body wouldn't obey. Instead, I stayed there, caught between my fear and something else that I couldn't name. He was looking at me now, really looking at me, as if he was seeing me for the first time. It made my chest tighten, made my heart skip a beat. I knew he felt it too, the shift, the change. But neither of us said anything. Neither of us knew how to. The silence stretched on, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. I wanted to say something, anything to break the tension, but my words caught in my throat. It felt like everything I had been trying to ignore was finally coming to the surface. It was as if the universe was waiting for me to make the next move, to decide whether I was going to confront this feeling or pretend it didn't exist. But I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't ignore the way my heart raced when he was near, or the way his touch sent electric currents through my skin. It was too much to deny. This wasn't just a friendship anymore. This was something else entirely. And I didn't know what to do with it. The tension was unbearable, and as we sat there in the dim light of the living room, I realized something. This was just the beginning. The beginning of something I couldn't control. The beginning of something that would change everything between us. It was the night everything changed. The night we could no longer pretend we didn't feel what was between us. The weight of everything had been building to this moment, and I couldn't escape it anymore. It had started with small, subtle shifts, like the way David's gaze lingered a little too long, or the way his hand brushed mine when we weren't even trying to touch. It had started with the quiet moments, the ones where we were alone, and something unspoken hung between us. But tonight, it wasn't just quiet, it was charged. David had invited me over to the house, just like old times. Lucas was away again, off with friends, and it was just the two of us. He said he needed help with a few things around the house, and I didn't hesitate to agree, even though I knew what this meant. I had known it for days now, ever since I realized that the tension between us was no longer just a passing thing, it was real. And I could feel it deep in my chest, every time I saw him, every time he spoke. Tonight would be different. I knew it. He knew it. We had spent the evening together, working on a project in the garage, but everything felt off. The normal camaraderie wasn't there. Instead, there was this undercurrent of something deeper, something more intense. Every glance we exchanged felt like an unspoken question, and neither of us knew how to answer it. The more we worked, the more I felt myself drawn to him, like gravity was pulling me closer, despite my better judgment. Finally, when the work was done and the tools had been put away, we sat down on the couch, side by side, in a comfortable silence that had become anything but. The lights were dim, the only sounds the occasional creak of the house or the distant hum of traffic outside. I could feel the air between us thick with unspoken words, and I realized I had reached the point of no return. There was no pretending anymore. This had gone too far to be ignored. David shifted beside me, his body language different from usual. Tense, but somehow more open, more vulnerable. He cleared his throat before speaking, his voice low, almost hesitant, as though testing the waters. "I think we need to talk." The words hit me like a freight train. I nodded, though my stomach was a tight knot of nerves. I knew where this was going, but I wasn't ready for it. I didn't know if I was ready for it. My mouth went dry, my heart racing in my chest as I struggled to find my voice. "Yeah," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I think we do." There was a long pause as he turned to face me, his eyes searching mine. His expression was unreadable, but the intensity in his gaze was unmistakable. He leaned forward slightly, as if closing the distance between us, and for a moment, I thought he might say something. Something that would finally break the silence, break the tension. But he didn't. Instead, his hand moved, slowly, deliberately, until it rested on the arm of the couch, just inches away from mine. I could feel my breath catch in my throat, my heart pounding in my ears. His touch was so close, so tempting, and yet, I was frozen. I wanted to move closer, wanted to reach out and take his hand, but I was terrified of what that would mean. Terrified of crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. David's voice broke the silence again, this time quieter, more urgent. "I don't know what's happening between us, but I can't ignore it anymore." I felt my pulse spike, my body tense. I wanted to say something, to tell him I felt the same way, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't speak. I was too afraid of what would happen if I did. His gaze softened, and he sighed, running a hand through his hair as if trying to make sense of everything. "I've tried to pretend, to tell myself that it's nothing, but I can't anymore. You mean something to me, more than I can explain. And I don't know if you feel the same way, but I can't keep pretending." It was like the ground beneath me had shifted. My heart was racing, my mind was spinning, and for the first time, I couldn't hold it back any longer. The truth was out in the open, hanging between us, raw and vulnerable. He had said it. He had finally said the words I had been too afraid to say. "I do," I whispered, barely above a breath. "I feel the same way." David's eyes widened, and for a moment, it felt like everything stopped. There was a silence between us, a moment of pure, aching stillness, and I could see the way his emotions were warring inside him. His disbelief, his confusion, his longing. I don't know if we should be doing this," he said, his voice cracking slightly, as though he was struggling to hold himself together. "I don't know if this is right, but I can't help how I feel. And I can't pretend anymore." I understood. The same conflict was raging inside me. There were so many reasons why this shouldn't be happening, why we shouldn't be having this conversation, but I couldn't stop the way my body was reacting to him, to his words. I couldn't stop the way I had been craving this, craving him, for so long. And now, as we sat there, vulnerable and exposed, there was nothing left to do but face it. "I don't want to pretend anymore either," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't stop thinking about you, David. I can't stop feeling this." He seemed to struggle with the weight of my words, his brow furrowing as if he was trying to understand what this meant for both of us. His hand twitched slightly, as though he wanted to reach out, but hesitated, unsure of what the consequences would be. I reached out first, my hand trembling as I placed it over his. The contact was electric, the warmth of his skin sending a jolt of desire through me. We both froze, the air thick with anticipation, as if waiting for the other to make the next move. But we didn't need words anymore. We knew. We both knew. David's hand moved, his fingers gently wrapping around mine, pulling me closer. His face was inches from mine, his breath warm against my skin, and I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same longing and hesitation that mirrored my own. He leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a hesitant kiss. It was soft at first, gentle, as if testing the waters, but when I didn't pull away, when I kissed him back, he deepened it, his hands cupping my face, pulling me closer, as though he never wanted to let go. The kiss felt like everything had finally fallen into place. There was no more tension, no more confusion. There was only this, only the feeling of his lips on mine, the way his body pressed against me, the way his touch made me feel like I was home. It was everything I had been yearning for and more, and for the first time, I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel afraid. We pulled back slowly, both of us breathless, our foreheads resting against each other. There were no words between us, no need for them. The unspoken understanding was all we needed. Everything had changed, and there was no going back. David closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling shakily. "I don't know what this means," he said softly, "but I know I can't walk away from it." I nodded, my heart racing in my chest. "Neither can I." And in that moment, I realized that we had crossed a line, one that neither of us could uncross. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't want to. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Everything had changed, and yet, nothing had changed at all. We were still the same people we had been, but somehow, it felt like we were seeing each other through a new lens, one that was clearer, sharper, and infinitely more complicated. The kiss, the unspoken feelings, everything that had led up to that moment, it was all still fresh in my mind, playing over and over like a loop that I couldn't escape. But now, there was no turning back. David and I didn't talk about it at first. We didn't have to. It was like this silent understanding between us, as though we were both giving each other the space to process what had happened. But the tension remained, thick and undeniable, hanging in the air whenever we were in the same room. It wasn't uncomfortable, though. Not exactly. There was a quiet, simmering intimacy that lingered, a constant reminder of what we had shared. It was during one of those quiet moments, a few days after that night, when David finally broke the silence. We were sitting together on the porch, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. There was something peaceful about it, about the way the evening light softened everything around us, but I could feel the weight of his words building in the space between us. He turned to me, his face unreadable but his eyes full of something I couldn't quite place. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "About everything. About us." My heart skipped a beat. The words were so simple, yet they carried so much weight. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, unsure of what he wanted from me. We hadn't really talked about it since that night, and the thought of opening up those emotions again felt almost too much to bear. But at the same time, I knew it was something we couldn't leave unresolved. I don't know what this means, he continued, his gaze turning toward the horizon as if searching for an answer out there. But I know that it's not easy. It's not something I can just ignore, and I don't want to make things harder for you or for us. He paused, taking a deep breath. I care about you. A lot. More than I've let myself admit. His words struck me like a chord, and suddenly everything I had been feeling, the confusion, the longing, the fear, came rushing to the surface. I didn't know how to process it all, but in that moment, I didn't have to. His honesty, his vulnerability, made me feel like I wasn't alone in this. We were both in the same place, both struggling with what had happened, but we were also trying to figure out what came next. I care about you too, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I think I always have. The words felt like a confession, but in the same breath, they felt like a release. Like something had been waiting to be said, something that had been buried too deep for too long. David didn't respond right away. Instead, he sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of my words settle between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost contemplative. I'm not sure where we go from here, he said slowly, but I know I can't ignore this anymore. I can't pretend like nothing has changed, because it has. But that doesn't mean we have to have all the answers right now. We don't have to figure it all out in one night. It was such a simple statement, but it hit me with an overwhelming sense of clarity. There was no rush to figure everything out, no pressure to have everything mapped out. We didn't need to know exactly what this would mean for our future. We just needed to take it one step at a time. And that was something I hadn't allowed myself to believe before. I had been so caught up in the fear of what this might mean, of what other people might think, that I hadn't stopped to consider what I actually wanted, what we wanted. I took a deep breath, my mind still racing but now grounded by his words. I don't know where this is going either, I said, the words coming more easily now. But I know that I don't want to lose you. I don't want to walk away from this just because it's complicated. David looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment, I could see the same uncertainty in his gaze. But there was something else there too. Something that felt like hope, like a possibility for something more. I don't want to lose you either, he replied, his voice gentle but firm. I don't know what happens next, but I want to figure it out with you. And in that moment, it felt like a promise. Not one that could be easily kept, or one that didn't come with risks, but a promise to try. To take things slowly, to be open with each other, and to see where this path would lead us. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it was honest. And that was enough for me. We didn't make any big decisions that night. We didn't suddenly have all the answers. But we didn't need them. What mattered was that we were both committed to finding a way through this together, no matter how difficult it might be. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy, and we both knew that. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. I wasn't afraid of us. The next few weeks were filled with quiet conversations, hesitant touches, and moments of vulnerability. There were still moments when the uncertainty crept in, when the world outside seemed to judge us for what we were doing, for what we were becoming. But in those moments, I held on to the promise we had made, to take it one day at a time, to be honest with each other, and to not let fear dictate our choices. The tension didn't vanish overnight, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but there was a sense of peace that I had never known before. I knew that whatever happened, whatever came next, I wasn't facing it alone. We weren't facing it alone. And so, as the weeks went by and life returned to its rhythm, I found myself learning to live with the uncertainty, with the complexity of our situation. I didn't have all the answers, and maybe I never would. But I had David, and I had the promise we had made, to face the future together, no matter where it took us. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Some things don't have neat endings, and maybe this wasn't one of those stories with a clear, definitive resolution. But that was okay. Sometimes, the best stories are the ones that don't end, the ones that leave you wondering what happens next, what will unfold in the days, weeks, and months to come. And as I sat there with David, watching the sun set over the horizon, I realized that this, whatever it was the beginning of something new. Something worth exploring. Together.